Hello, George. Hello, Palo.
Hey,
How are you doing, Michael?
Doing great. How are you guys doing?
very good.
Excellent.
Today we have a new face in the room. We have Palo Marquez. Palo's pretty new to the company. Palo, you've been with Trustero, doing some work with Trustero for a while, but when did you officially join?
I officially joined about 2 weeks ago, March 17th.
March 17th. That's awesome. It feels like it's been a lot longer than that already.
Yeah, it's been about 9 months since I worked with Trustero and officially joined full time as of 2 weeks ago.
We're extremely lucky to have you. I think everybody on the team shares that sentiment. So officially what you're doing for us is you are a customer advisor in the GRC space, which has been incredibly important to us. And then you also run our internal audit, which it just so happens is what we're going to talk about today. So George, why don't you kind of lead us off and explain the topic and tell us what are we going to talk about today in terms of internal audit?
Yeah, Paulo, I'm super excited to have you today as part of this fireside conversations.
Yeah.
And even last time when we were discussing with Michael, we were talking about how AI assistants are helping not only the GRC team itself, but also it spreads throughout the organization. And last time we talked about how that changes the relationship and dynamics between GRC and IT. And as an example, we gave also internal audit because GRC team works a lot with internal audit. And then the thought popped in our mind, hey, but we actually have a resident internal audit expert here. So we decided to kind of have a conversation with you to understand in the modern internal audit, what are the challenges and how do you see AI helping with those challenges and transforming maybe the internal audit function?
I know, great.
So let's start with something simple because kind of there are two. Internal audit is a pretty big space, and there are kind of two functions that I'm more familiar with. One is the actual audit, and the other one is something called operational assessments, which essentially is like a risk assessment that internal audit does. And why don't you walk us through how internal audit approaches the actual audit and what is involved in that audit and how you interact with the GRC function and the GRC tools?
So I guess it will be good to the types of internal audit. I think you mentioned at least two of them. I want to add one more type. So first is the actual internal audit in preparation for an external audit, right? Because as we know, IA is a third line of defense within the company.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that we're able to review the risks and then mitigate the risk before anybody externally comes into play. So the actual internal audit process here is we want to make sure that we're working with the GRC teams, the support teams, second line of defense, so to speak, to ensure that all the risks are mitigated. And in order to do that, it's simple, right? 3 steps of internal audit is very akin to the steps of external audit as well. So first we plan, then we do the field work, then we do the reporting. So during the planning phase for this particular type of audit, we try to gather the stakeholders. We need to know who to talk to, what to talk about, determine the key areas of interest, and then we build a work program around that. And then what that work program will constitute of, it's very similar to how we know test procedures, right? Like what are we testing? How are we testing that? And then how are we going to document that? What are the type of documentations we're going to consider? After that, during field work, that's essentially when we start executing our walkthroughs. We start talking with various stakeholders, getting their opinion, they're getting an idea of what they do, what they're responsible and accountable for a particular process or control. And then expediting this to the reporting process is essentially you're now going to create an executive summary, which will be reportable up to senior management, usually C-suite or higher, like C-suite and then board of directors. And then we can also create a more tactical report that will involve details of, well, what did we find during field work? What are some issues? How can we remediate those issues? And these would be report that is applicable to the stakeholders themselves. Like we're talking about like the managers of engineering, principals, architects. It could also be an HR manager if there are HR issues. just to give you an example of who we report this to as well. And then after that, in between audits, we also have continuous monitoring. We want to make sure that if we have identified these issues, we're tracking them to remediation. So that's kind of the basic internal audit 101 for that specific audit type, which is the, your regular internal audit before external auditors come in. The second type here is also as you described earlier, which is the operational audit. So operational audits can be pretty much anything and everything you can think of. I've done M&A audits, RPA, robotic process automation. We've done audits with treasury and accounting, accounts payable. Another fun audit that I've been part of is procurement, right? Like looking at the procurement process. So it's essentially, it coins the term operational because how does the company operate? How does the company work? Right. And then you pull in internal auditors to be your business partners. And that's one thing I want to emphasize is internal auditors should be business partners, not quote unquote auditors, because there's kind
Yeah.
of a negative connotation to the word auditors. So I always emphasize we're business partners. And then, okay, let's take a look at your process. Let's take a look at who's in charge of it, who does it, who executes specific processes, and then how can we improve it further, right? And that's the whole concept of the operational audits. And it follows the same trajectory too. So planning, field work,
Mhm.
reporting, and then continuous monitoring after that.
But
Um,
they're not related to a particular compliance framework or particular regulation. It's more like the management decides, okay, I need to, or the board decides, I need to know more about the risks in this particular area. Can the internal audit do the assessment?
Correct. Yeah. So it does not have to be related to a particular framework. And also, I think you touched on it a little bit. A lot of these initiatives are driven by senior management team within those verticals, right? Like whether it's the accounting team or the HR team, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but also the board can also direct this. They might
Right.
review what are the top 10 risks for our company for this particular industry. Okay, let's pull in internal audit so that they can take a look from an independent perspective. And,
So it's interesting.
mhm,
It's interesting how a lot of what you're describing is very similar to the second line of defense about risk and compliance function. But the biggest difference here is the independence between the two. And I would assume that you have similar challenges like the second line of defense, which is um, everyone you talk to understands that you're doing something important and you're helping the company as a whole, but that is not part of their core mandate. You go and talk to finance, but finance has to do other things and they're helping you. Of course, they're trying to help you, but it's not a value add for them. It's not what they do. Right. And I see the same challenge for us. So I'm wondering, how do you usually address this thing from an internal audit perspective?
Do you just bring treats?
that could be a factor, Michael. I've worked with a legal team in the past where if we actually bring snacks to the room before our walkthrough meetings, that kind of, energizes them to actually
Softens the
participate and
tension.
collaborate. Yeah, exactly. So I would not rule that out. To answer your question, George, one of the things that will help make this effective, because to your point, right, it's not part of their day-to-day job. If anything, this is a side job for them. So one is we need to encourage them about the benefits of this. There's a lot of reassurances that happens where we say, okay, the regardless of the findings for the internal audit report, your job is not going to be in danger, right? We are not targeting your jobs because a lot of times
Yeah.
that's the inherent fear there. If you say, oh, an auditor is coming in, internal or external, oh, shoot, if there's findings in my area and I'm the control owner, I'm going to get fired. No, that's not the case. So we want to
Yeah.
create reassurances, right? The second part here is management support. Very important, right? Because if you just execute an internal audit, let's say directed by the board, but let's say the chief legal officer does not agree with it, right? Then it's gonna be a dull, empty-ish internal audit, right? Because you're not gonna get that management support backing it. The other motivator to these engagements, too, internal engagements in this case, is making sure that they're comfortable with you. So one of the things we do in the internal audit function is also business process reengineering, right?
Mhm.
So, how can I enhance your job so that you look good as the stakeholder? How can I uncover some things that can be improved so that you, as the stakeholder, will have essentially a value proposition, not only to solidify who you are and what you do for the company, but also so you can make sure that, hey, this is why my function is important.
Yeah. That is kind of interesting because you may run into some catch 22 situations where you have to spend time with internal audit in order to get something back, some kind of an improvement, right? So, first you have to allocate time in order to be able to get time back.
Mm.
And I'm wondering, do you think AI can help us with that?
Absolutely. I feel like in the past 5 years, there's been a lot of, and I quote this with great emphasis, right? There's been a lot of interest in shifting toward AI. But with that said, there's still a lot of clinging into the old ways of doing internal
Mhm.
audits, which is without AIs, which is using spreadsheets, which is manually doing follow ups, right? So things like that. Because in the past, it's worked, right? Why would we change
Yeah.
it if it's worked? So they
Yeah.
don't quite get the use case of or the advantages of having AI incorporated into the internal audit process. However, the internal audit shops that I know use AI have actually not only made them more efficient, which is usually the number one use case,
That's
right?
the obvious thing. Yeah.
Yeah, you do things faster, sure. But at the same time, it makes everybody's job easier, right? Earlier, George, you touched on the fact that, okay, if I'm the auditee, right, and then Paulo, the internal auditor, is auditing me, then there's an issue because it's not part of my day-to-day job. Well, what if I tell you by incorporating AI, you can start automating a lot of that, anywhere from, shortening the walkthrough sessions instead of sitting with you as the auditee for an hour, maybe we can only sit with you for 30 minutes because the AI can already determine what you have in your environment, basically answer a lot of the preliminary discovery type audit questions that I would have taken half an hour otherwise to ask you anyway. So that's just
Yeah.
one use case.
Frankly, this has been one of the biggest pain points whenever I interact with auditors for the other side of the house. That has been the biggest pain point, that I have to sit for like 2 3 hours with the external auditor. First of all, there is a prepping session that happens,
Yep.
and then I have to sit down with the external auditor or the internal auditor for several hours just to explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it this way. And I always said, oh, you know what, it would be amazing if we have some repository of all that information and I can give it to the auditor and say, hey, read it, work with it, and let me know if you have any questions.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the key. Like a lot of my stakeholders in the past, they always ask for a pre-read, right?
Mhm.
To make sure that, I want to be prepared for your internal audit questions. Can
Right.
you give me a pre-read? So imagine instead of now going back to me as the internal auditor, instead of me spending like 30 minutes, an hour writing that pre-read, why not have AI do it, right? I already know what guardrails I can incorporate, what topic I want to cover. I just create the prompt for that, which will take me a few minutes, right? And then that will save me an hour's worth of time in return.
Yeah. And that's kind of a very obvious, very close example. So that's actually kind of my next question. You touched upon it, that internal audit and external auditors in general tend to be very conservative.
Mhm.
So that's why they're one of the last to adopt new technology or new methodology. So, so if you have to use AI, what are the top 3 things that come to mind that auditors will feel more at ease using AI versus, oh my God, that's a big thing and I cannot really adopt it at this point?
Yeah. So I think one of them would be using the AI to generate essentially the pre-read content, right? Whether it's a simple email to give you a heads up as my stakeholder and tell you, hey, this is what we're going to cover for this session. These are the questions you're going to expect. And this is how we're going to conclude the session, right? The outcomes that we desire to have at the end of the session. So that's already inherent, like with Gen AI itself, right? You can create that through ChatGPT or Gemini or other AI tools out there. But if you want to add context to it, GRC tools like a Trustero, right, could actually be leveraged for that. Because let's say you already have the policies, evidence, and controls from your particular corporate environment, then you can generate the prompts or you can generate the questions based out of that content already. Then it's more pointed when you create that pre-read memo.
Can I take this to the next level?
hmm
I know that I'm asking a little bit of an extreme question, but do you see future where you don't even create those questionnaires? You interact with the AI directly, and that's how you obtain your information.
Yes, but to the point of hesitation, right? A lot of auditors in general, right? Internal or
Yeah.
external, being conservative as they are, and the profession itself being conservative, there's going to be questions on, okay, how do you handle my security and privacy for this? Just because
Mhm.
you have an ISO 42001 certification doesn't mean that the interaction between stakeholder to AI or internal auditor to AI, that interaction won't be saved or captured or shared elsewhere, right? So
Mhm.
sometimes certifications are not enough. More conservative auditors might ask for some more solid proof of concept, right? Like show me the back end code, right? Like making sure that this does not go out. Show me references from my other peers
Uh-huh.
that they're already using this. Things like that, right? Like prove it to me.
Yeah. So in this case, we're talking about probably the next generation of AI assistants that are much more sophisticated and have access to much more data.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and that to continue on your top three earlier, so I mentioned the pre-read memo. The second use case that internal auditors could use AI on also is discovery, right? One of the biggest challenges that we've had in the past is how do I determine what are my crown jewels within the enterprise? Right? If you are the GRC team and you've put so much effort already as far as uploading your policies, your controls, and your evidence into your GRC platform, then why the hell why not leverage that, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's already there, right? So use the payload that's already in the platform to start discovering crown jewels relevant to the enterprise. Because by knowing that, I, as an internal auditor, would be able to help determine what are the risks related to the organizations and then help you prioritize on, okay, let's say we're tracking 25 audit issues, right? How does that relate to the risks that we know of? And then how does that relate to, the prioritization as well?
Can you help me understand, as the only non-lifer here, why would they not already know what the crown jewels are? How do they not know?
So the challenge comes from if you're an enterprise type company, right? A lot of times you have multiple verticals, multiple departments, multiple stakeholders. And even though, let's say you have a tool that scans for crown jewel type assets, doesn't mean that they're all there, right? Back in my experience when I was at NetApp, we have this concept of a dome, but within a dome where we shelter our IPs, right? There's domes within the dome, right? So it's hard because some domes are more manual, and by manual, I mean you might be a cloud engineer and you house your crown jewels, let's say your code, right? Your proprietary code. You house it within your own Google Drive, right? So it's like, well, that's not really connected to the internet. It's not scannable, so it's harder to detect, it's harder to know. Whereas, let's say the GRC team has already done their own diligence, done their own discovery, they might have already detected that and then uploaded, whether it's a memo, a note, something, right? Some documentation, some control into their GRC tool. And then as internal auditors, we can use that to line up what we care about from a crown jewels perspective.
So, Michael, in a way, this is the same problem we have in the security space, which is nobody knows everything. And the
Uh-huh.
thing is that the environment is changing so much that even if you know everything, 6 months from now, you don't. So I guess the internal audit faces exactly the same issue. But speaking about findings from your use case, findings is really a hot topic always.
Mhm.
Because first of all, there is a lot of discussion of, okay, this is the design finding, operational finding. And then after that is kind of tracking it when it's going to be resolved. And I have to tell you that it's resolved and you have to come and check in order to close it. And there is a lot of back and forth organizing meetings, which slows down the entire process. I actually had cases when it took me longer to get an approval of closure compared to the time it took me to actually close it.
Mhm.
Right. So I solved the problem rather quickly. And then 3 months down the road, I finally get on the backlog on the internal audit for them to close the issue. Do you foresee a case when you can use AI for that? Because again, if AI is properly contextualized with the environment and you create some kind of a rule, okay, if you see this thing, then the finding is closed. Do you foresee that happening?
Yeah, I think you sort of touched on it already, George. So similar idea. Back in my internal audit days, we actually called it machine learning. So we
Mhm.
were able to categorize specific type of issues and their prioritization and their severity and their impact, etc. Right? Once you add those tags and flags into the audit issue, then you can create a machine learning algorithm, or in this case, you can have AI review it, right? And say, okay, this is a minor issue. We can do auto approve, right? Not a problem. Once the work has been done, once the issue has been remediated, because it's minor, we don't need an approval from a VP or an SVP, for
Mhm,
example.
mhm. We can
Uh,
rely on the machine learning.
Exactly, exactly. With AI nowadays, you can start creating guardrails. You can start creating rule sets that say, okay, if it meets XYZ criteria, then provide approval. If it does not, let's say we need two levels of approval, then escalate it to the VP. And if VP is out of office, then escalate it to the SVP, something like that,
Mhm,
right? So the
mhm.
whole approval process, because of that, will be one, it will be more efficient, but the escalation will also be more structured, because sometimes
Right.
in my personal experience, right, the whole approval and escalation process is not always very straightforward, right? You would think, okay, if my VP is Michael and then my SVP is George, if Michael does not approve, then let's go to George. Well, what if Michael does not approve and George is out? It happens, right? Is the audit issue then just blocked, right? Or on hold?
Right.
There are ways that we can redirect that to like a parallel vertical, and then we can get it approved that way. But again, with AI, you don't need to like do fact finding saying, okay, who
Mhm.
else has the right authority to approve this audit issue before we can consider it resolved, right? Again, it all comes down to the prompt, how you build it, how you create guardrails around it, the rule sets, the right tagging and flagging that's involved.
Great. And you had a third case in mind?
Yeah. So the third case is actually leveraging GRC tools as both an internal audit and a GRC function. So to your point, George, earlier, we talked about, well, sometimes GRC is very similar to internal audit in terms of what we do, right? Like AKA
Yeah.
assessments. Well, if we have a single source of truth, right? Let's say
Mhm.
name your GRC tool. Then we can both use that GRC tool as far as if I want to learn about a particular control, a particular gap, a particular issue that needs to be remediated. Why don't I just look into that GRC tool and then get my answers from there, right? Why don't I just work more closely with my second line of defense, with my GRC people, and then we can just collect evidence once and then apply to many, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Because this has always been a pain point for a lot of my first line of defense
Yeah.
stakeholders. It's like, okay, George and his team actually came here 2 months ago. Why don't you go to them for the evidence you're asking me right now? Because it's the
Right.
same thing, it's the same ask.
And then you have to start explaining about independence and sampling and all
Exactly.
those kind of things.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, yes, at the end, there is a reason why we do that, but that doesn't make it easier to an IT engineer who spent 2 hours with us and then he has to spend 2 hours with you.
Yeah. But I have a hot take. It does not have to be an independence violation, right? Just because we share the same
Right.
samples, just because we share the same evidence, it doesn't have to be an independence issue because as internal auditors, we're still going to issue our own opinion, right? We're not going to copy and paste what the GRC team did. We're actually going to
Mhm.
have our own opinion of
Yeah.
the matter of the audit, right? So it's
And that doesn't preclude us from using the same system, the same GRC AI system. And
exactly
then we can take it to the next level, not just doing the audit, but also doing risk analysis. Like
correct.
what is
Yeah.
going to happen if we do this or if we do that.
Exactly. Yeah, in the past, there's been hesitations because of that whole independence conflict, but also how do we share the cost, right? In the
Yeah.
past, the CAE, chief audit executive, or the head of internal audit would have a separate budget from the CISO, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
they would not want to share for whatever, name your reasons, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but now we're in an environment where things are fast paced, things are growing, and I feel like we can achieve more together, right? So let's say you split the cost, right? 50% of
Right.
the cost will be covered by the second
Or we
line, and
double
then
it and get something better.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. This was very interesting. I learned quite a bit, kind of
Okay.
hearing from the other side. Thank you so much,
Me too.
Paulo. Any
Me too, but I always
closing
do.
thoughts?
Closing thoughts, work with your GRC teams and your internal audit teams. We're your business partners, not people that are out there to get your jobs.
Yep. Yeah.
Auditors are good. Auditors are good. Okay, guys. Well, appreciate you as always. Palo, can't wait till we have you on here again. You are a vast wealth of topics, so I'm sure we'll have you on here pretty soon.
Sounds good. Thank you very much for having me.